Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, when I first heard there was a village in Connecticut called Ivoryton, I just thought it was some quaint name picked by somebody years ago. I didn't know that Ivoryton and neighboring Deep River hosted factories that between them, get this, produced 90% of all the ivory products consumed globally. And they did this for decades. Well, the story of how and why it happened and why the industry died off is going to be shared with us today by our guest, Melissa Josefiak. Melissa is director of the Essex Historical Society. That's a town with 3 villages, and Ivoryton is one of the 3. Melissa will be along with us momentarily. This week's trivia question: back in the 1600s, this Connecticut city was so successful at river trading that people called it New Boston. What was the city? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Pratt Reed and Comstock Cheney. Remember those names, you're going to hear them a lot in this episode. They were 2 fantastic old-fashioned factories in the lower Connecticut River Valley that between them combined to produce 90% of all the ivory products manufactured worldwide in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Now today we're going to focus mainly on Comstock Cheney because that was the company that gave the town they were located in the idyllic and rather enchanting name that survived until this day, the village of Ivoryton. It's a story unlike other former factory towns from Connecticut's bustling Industrial Revolution era that you're probably used to hearing. And the key is that Ivoryton is still a lively town, even though the business that built it is long gone. Sure, the old factory buildings aren't exactly pristine, but everything around them is. And most importantly, those old buildings aren't just some abandoned hazardous waste sites. They both have active tenants. Now, you may raise your eyebrows a bit when you hear ivory, because you might say, well, didn't that cause an international uproar because it comes from the tusks of endangered elephants? And you'd be right. That's an issue that the village did have to face head on, along with a handful of others. Now, Ivoryton is one of 3 villages within the town of Essex. It's a gorgeous place on the Connecticut River. The other villages are Essex Village itself and Centerbrook. In fact, Ivoryton, before it was called Ivoryton, was called West Centerbrook, back when it had a mere 10 houses. It's a great story, and here to share it with us is Melissa Josefiak, director of the Essex Historical Society. Melissa, as we talked about the incredible nature of this Ivoryton community, and we're going to get into all the aspects of it, but I want to start off by getting people acquainted with ivory, what you use ivory for. And I think, we've heard the old term tickling the ivories when you're talking about playing the piano. But one of the things I learned researching this, and I felt stupid that I didn't know this until now, was that the keys themselves are not made out of ivory. It's just the veneer. So could you give me a little sort of rundown on what ivory does or did and what kind of products were made there?
Sure. The inherent qualities of ivory is that it's cool and smooth and feels wonderful to the human touch. So it's always been a luxury item for thousands of years. It's also soft and easy to carve. It wears well, and it basically is just beautiful. Many civilizations have been using ivory for religious reasons, for practical reasons, and by the time we get into the 18th century, ivory is perfect for a variety of different musical instruments, especially ones with keys. with the development, the pianoforte and ultimately the piano. Every single key takes up to 90 small parts just to strike the chord. But when you depress the key, you want something smooth and elegant and soft. And when the human finger can just slide off the key so beautifully in ivory because of its quality, it was a perfect fit for musical instruments, especially ones with a keyboard. So as the demand for ivory increases, so does the production. It has always been a very desirable commodity.
The next thing I want to get into is Ivoryton itself wasn't Ivoryton when this whole thing started. It was West Centerbrook, which is one of the villages in the town of Essex. So we're going back to the 1700s. And at that point in time, there are just 10 houses in this West Centerbrook area. It's not good for agricultural purposes. And it would grow into this great ivory manufacturing area. Tell me about the guy who's really responsible for this, Samuel Merritt Comstock. What's his background?
So Comstock is part of an earlier family in Essex. His father was a ship captain. He's one of at least 11 children. There are limited possibilities for advancement. West Centerbrook itself, it's got very steep hillsides sloping down to the Falls River. So it's largely lumbering that's going on there, a lot of general forested areas. So Comstock is always a tinkerer, and there has been an engineering tradition in the lower Connecticut River Valley. I mean, we literally had the technology to cut ivory and bone very fine. And Comstock, his uncles, his brothers, these tinkering engineering types are looking for ways to make a living for themselves. And Comstock's not always successful. He's taken on several partners. They always have a supply problem. Getting ivory from Africa itself is always a challenge. But Comstock is somewhat of an engineering genius, and he has that technology, and he's looking for partners and way to move his various businesses forward. And by 1847, he moves west into West Centerbrook and dams the Falls River, basically across from the house he grew up in. And he starts the Samuel Comstock Company to cut ivory. And that continues for about 13 years before he eventually meets his partner, George Cheney, who is an ivory importer.
Now let's talk about this. I don't want to make this the center of this, but it's sort of like the gold industry and the diamond industry. Sometimes in Africa, they use underage people or sort of enslaved people. The same thing was true with the tusk trade with elephants. Could you just sort of give us an overview of what that consisted of and why ultimately that became an issue for the industry?
Access to ivory is a challenge. Obviously, an elephant needs to die to extract a tusk. It is hard to get ivory from Africa for a whole host of reasons, not just for transportation. So when Samuel Comstock is connected with George Cheney, Cheney's already in the importation business. He had married into the Green family that has been trading in East Africa, specifically the island of Zanzibar, with the Omani traders that are there. So elephants are smart animals. When they know they're being hunted, they move, and they move away from those areas of civilization. The Omani traders are always on the hunt for ivory, and they are enslaving people and enslaving, in some cases, whole villages to track the elephants that are moving west into deeper Africa. So there is a complicated trade web that involves the enslavement of those Africans in Africa, and that those people are hunting the elephants, extracting the tusks, bringing them for hundreds of miles at one point by hand to Zanzibar, where the tusks are traded and sold to Western European brokers. And then those enslaved Africans, if they do make the coast, are sold into slavery. So there is a complicitness with Western Europe and with the ivory purchasers in Ivoryton and in Deep River, which is also running an ivory business. And this goes on from before the Civil War, actually goes back to the 1830s in connection with the lower Connecticut River Valley, well into the 20th century.
Now, you talk about the technology of carving ivory. Now, you could do it by hand, but if you're ever going to get into mass production, you got to have machines to do it. And as you say, the river valley in that area was full of entrepreneurs and tinkerers and inventors. And this was key to it, wasn't it? Coming up with the machines that could do this, make combs and all the other different items that needed to be made from ivory efficiently.
Yes, prior to the need for piano veneers, the number one product that these small artisanal shops were producing were combs. And it was combs for women's hair. If you think about the fashion of the beginning of the 19th century, they were decorative, but then also combs are very functional. Today, when we think of lice, there's all sorts of chemical treatments, but back then there's not. So as hygiene improves, people need tools to improve it. When we look at some of these tiny combs that are for hygiene purposes, it's amazing to see how slender, how strong those tines are cut. Those entrepreneurs really are, through these, water-powered machines, cutting the ivory very finely, so it becomes a luxury item, but also a very functional item, part of your hygiene kit. Some of the combs in our collections have absolutely perfect tines, and it's amazing. You could barely see through them, how finely cut they are.
I also find amazing about this overall story that the employer took a sort of a fatherly approach to this, if you will, and wanted to take care of his employees. And as the company grew, so did the village of Ivoryton, but basically on the back of the Comstock Cheney Company. Could you explain how that all happened?
Yes, so I wouldn't say it would be the very first town. There were certainly other factory towns in Connecticut and New England that were operating on a larger scale. But by the 1840s, and when Comstock partners with Cheney, the business really gets going. And of course, they need more workers. So it's not just those 10 households, but they're starting to attract other Yankee workers. They're building houses, they're encouraging people to live close to the factory. So Comstock, when he passes in the 1870s, then Cheney really takes that paternalistic vision to the next level. They want to keep their skilled workers. They want to keep them happy and working there for generations. Up to about 130 houses were built in Ivoryton alone. By 1900, they're building a fantastic grammar school, so the next generation can be encouraged to stay in the village. Eventually, that turns into various stores. What is today known as the Ivoryton Playhouse started out as Comstock Cheney Hall. There are a variety of houses of worship that they're also building, and eventually the trolley comes. So to keep their workers happy, they're making a self-contained factory village. As you're paying your workers, they're either renting or they're purchasing factory housing from you. They're buying their commodities in the stores owned by the factory or family members of the factory. And then there's a nice circulation of money staying within the village. So by 1900, Comstock Cheney and Ivoryton in general are supporting the town with 60% of the tax revenues. What's interesting about Ivoryton, though, is that when the business dried up, it almost became mothballed as a Victorian village, so that it was rediscovered back in the 1980s. There was much intact there. I don't know if I could make that claim of other factory villages, or there might be factory villages in Connecticut and New England that wish they had an Ivoryton story where they have had a rebirth. The lower shop in Ivoryton is now another factory. The upper shop, the large one, is being repurposed. But all of those workers' houses are still occupied. There are tenants in all of those stores. So when we look toward the future, some of those factory villages dry up, but Ivoryton is certainly successful in its second act, so to speak.
Now, the other thing, when you talk about the business drying up, let's talk about that because one of the, again, to me, intriguing aspects of this story, I'm sure it was quite sad in that area, is as the Depression came around and other factors, the need to have a piano. You tell this story so well, how people wanted to have a piano and that kind of sort of went away. Could we start off talking about that and how that helped grow the business and then ultimately sort of help kill the business?
Of course. So the middle of the 19th century, if you want to make an American parallel, the height of the Victorian era and the rise of the middle class, the growth of the Industrial Revolution. So as you have a middle class, you want to demonstrate that you're no longer part of the blue collar help. And this was true in my own family in the beginning of the 20th century, that a piano meant that you had arrived, the time of home entertainment, that you could afford entertainment within your home, that you could take your child and that they could learn piano. It truly meant that you had attained middle class success. And one of our wonderful walking tour guides, Chris Pagliuco, always talks about the piano as the granite countertops of its day. You had made it if you had a piano. But a piano is also a finite amount. If you have one, you don't need another one. There's no planned obsolescence for a piano. And as that great need rose, especially as America is moving west, there were hundreds of customers with various piano manufacturers that Comstock Cheney was producing the keyboards for. As we get into the 20th century, the business is going gangbusters. By 1910, it's really the high watermark for Comstock Cheney. And the village has grown to its probably the nth degree, and it's the dominant village of Essex's three villages, and things are going well. However, there are a number of factors at play. As you go into the 20th century, there are other forms of entertainment. The development of the record player. In the 1920s, there's going to be the radio. World War I, of course, interrupts any kind of ivory trade. And there are also a number of conversations about the ethical aspects of ivory, the enslavement of humans, the death of elephants. It is completely unsustainable for American purchasers to get their minds around. And as we go into the 20th century, the company recovers a little bit. But of course, the Great Depression, with so few jobs, people living hand to mouth, a greater amount of homeless people, that they're not thinking about entertainment. And certainly if they were, you can listen to the radio. You can go seek your entertainment elsewhere. When you get into the Depression, all of these factors are putting an incredible amount of pressure on Pratt Reed in Deep River and Comstock Cheney in Ivoryton. And Pratt Reed approaches Comstock Cheney to say, would you consider a merger? We both have these sprawling plants. We don't have the market anymore. And Comstock Cheney pushes them off. And it's not until 1936 when finally they agree. And Pratt Reed at this point has had a few years in the black through the management of their CEO, James Gould, who it comes from New York. And when the two companies merge, they take the name Pratt Reed and they combine both companies in the Ivoryton facility. By the time you get into, or the company gets into the threshold of World War II, they're just about to break even. But the company is never the same as it was prior to the Great Depression.
Pratt Reed, as that merged company located in Ivoryton was then called, went on to help out greatly during the World War II effort. They converted their factory to the building of gliders. Those are engine-less wooden planes that glided silently behind enemy lines in Europe and slid in for a landing so the soldiers could get off. They made 1,000 of those wooden gliders in the years during World War II. And another invention came along, an imitation ivory called Ivoryne. It looked and functioned and kind of felt like ivory, and it too was made by an invention that disrupted so many other industries, something called plastic, from which Ivoryne is made. Wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Melissa Josefiak, Director of the Essex Historical Society. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, back in the 1600s, this Connecticut city was so successful at river trading that people called it the New Boston. What was that city? Well, it was Derby, right where the Housatonic and Naugatuck rivers converge. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, Derby was a shipbuilding hub and major port for Western Connecticut for several decades back during the colonial period. Now, it's largely because of the building of one of the very first dedicated land-based trading paths in the state. It's It's known as the Old Woodbury Trail that connected Woodbury and Derby. Its importance cannot be overstated. And you're going to meet the gentleman who has spent the past decade piecing this truly remarkable story together. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.